Yes, students. So, hello and welcome. So, this time we are into our third conversation on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. After having finished with Hobbes and John Locke. Now, Rousseau is significant in more ways than one. With Hobbes and Locke, we are not contemplating, speculating revolution, but Rousseau, as you know, is always associated, somewhat wrongly, with the French Revolution. There are elements of revolution in Rousseau, of course, but as we had, thought previously, that it is not necessary to associate a particular thinker with a specific strand of, social or political event. A first-rate philosopher or a thinker, they are more than, these everyday items or events. You cannot exhaust a thinker with the stating of a particular fact, that he stood for this. No, Rousseau stood much more. He stood for something, which is much more grand and eloquent than simple French Revolution. Now, we have to make a distinction between two of our approaches. We approached Hobbes and Locke, and as I had told you repeatedly, that it is not necessary to consider their lives, glorious revolution or whatever, or civil war, right? When we are thinking of Hobbes and Locke. Because, one can think independently, beyond these happenings, right? It is absolutely irrelevant whether these social or political events, incited or excited their thought. We have to engage with political thought in its purity. But for Rousseau, it is a bit different, because Rousseau wrote nearly on everything, from music, autobiography, even moral and literary tracts, apart from political or social pieces. And as you know, he is today, discussed extensively in sociology, in political science, in moral theory, and even in music. That apart, he is also a major theorist of education. As you know, Rabindranath Tagore and his Shantiniketan, where it was primarily thought by Tagore to give education in a very natural setting, because he thought that general education in the colonial tradition of English schools was artificial and synthetic. There is a strand of thought which thinks that this was actually inspired by Rousseau. Now, what did Rousseau say on this? Rousseau often would say that, his whole philosophy, his whole attempt at, formulating his own thought could be summed up in one sentence. The sentence is that, we are proud enough to chart our progress from the state of nature to the state of, civil society. This is a familiar term by now, because in Hobbes and Locke, you'll find time and again a repetition of the state of nature and civil state. But Rousseau says that the moment we progress towards the civil state, it is a fallen state. We have arrived at a corrupt state. And Rousseau, in one of his early essays on the progress of arts and sciences, actually made this point with a lot of emphasis. He says that we have progressed in terms of arts and sciences. There is an immense sophistication in all our thoughts. But have we progressed in terms of morality? Have we progressed in terms of the genuine essence of human beings? But today if we invoke the Rousseauian question, it would be, we have progressed, but have men or human beings, have they become less murderous? Have they become more just? Do we see less theft, less crime, less murders today? No. We'll say, in fact, it is a fact that we shall, utter and agree with, that today we see more murders, more crimes taking place, right? More violations in all forms and all states of things, and which goes beyond the threshold of all geographical boundaries. Rousseau, in fact, was the first to have made this point very significantly and emphatically. He said, the moment we leave the state of nature and arrive at a society constituted by our rules and norms, there is a corruption which is taking place. But then, how to sort of resolve and sort of get beyond this corruption? Rousseau's solution was the social contract. But this social contract is very different from the, Hobbesian or the Lockean formulations. And this is, in fact, more visible because Rousseau actually wrote a whole book on the social contract, while they were thought experiments or strands of thought in Hobbes or Locke. So, in fact, today the social contract tradition is known more by the name of Rousseau than Locke or Hobbes. Now, the point is, where to start then? How does, Rousseau begin the whole, sort of exercise? This is important. Now, consider this. If we start with a particular moment in Rousseauian thought, that nature was good and the society corrupt, one could easily argue and interrogate that nature was, in fact, nature is supposed to have been completely neutral. I mean, you remember that these objections were already in some terms expressed in Locke or Hobbes, right? That in nature, there was nothing called justice or injustice. In nature is completely neutral to these kinds of formulations, which are basically synthetic and human formulations. We have formulated good and bad, justice or injustice. In nature, these things are not there at all. Okay, so how does, Rousseau formulate the nature as good and the society as corrupt? Now, this is a complex question which we shall, put aside for, our later lectures, second or third. But the point is important in the sense that in order to resolve this impasse, Rousseau holds on to the instrument of social contract, because he thinks that with the civil society or the civil state, civil social state, I mean the kind of society that we constitute, there what occurs is deception, dominance, oppression and dependence. So social contract as a resolution ushers in. It is for Rousseau a problem-solving procedure. And here Rousseau is a revolutionary thinker, because unlike, Locke or Hobbes, which they didn't state more explicitly, but in Rousseau, it is clear that the social contract basically is not happening between the people and the sovereign, right? The king or the absolute ruler or whatever. It is happening among the people themselves, in the community. In fact, he goes in very clear terms to argue against the king, the despot, or the absolute state. Okay? Now, the point is, how does Rousseau then arrive at this problem-solving procedure? And what is the consequence of this procedure? This social contract. Does Rousseau introduce, a new term in the whole inventory? He does, in fact. You remember that we discussed, while we were sort of, arguing and conversing and talking with Locke or Hobbes, there was a concept called the will. Even Locke, talked a lot about the free will, right? And contrasted it against freedom. Free will, freedom, we were discussing all this. But in Rousseau, the will becomes political for the first time. For Locke or Hobbes, these are basically philosophical concepts. But Rousseau, while he introduces the concept of general will as the idea, the methodological idea of social contract, he introduces the political will. And this is where Rousseau is very different from Locke and Hobbes and is very, very important. This general will, or will in terms of will of the people, political will, political interest, public interest, these are concepts which were formulated in some form or the other by Rousseau. Rousseau talks, as like Locke and Hobbes, about the self-preservation of people or human beings. But for Rousseau, this self-preservation is a negative concept. I mean, even in the state of nature, right? There was, as you know, everybody had the right to sort of all fruits or all products of nature. And all were scared about their own lives. And in Locke, property was added to the concept of life. People were scared, right? How to preserve life and property. But for Rousseau, this self-preservation is connected with some form of, passion. Self-preservation as an instinct is a negative in the sense Rousseau tries to pit it against this concept, the point of compassion and pity, even for animals. Right. In self-preservation, people try to sort of, grasp and gather everything for himself or herself. In compassion or pity, they try to sort of, give away things in order to, alleviate the sufferings of others, including animals, without harming, one's own self-interest. Now, this is a very, very sort of path-breaking and a benchmark for Rousseau, that Rousseau introduces a typical erotic, a kind of sexual concept, a metaphor, sexual comparison, to discuss the concept of self-preservation. He says that we are sort of endowed with not only the instinct of self-preservation, but also self-estimation, self-regard, and our hunger to be recognized by others. We are sort of always hungry to look for some value. Self-value coming, up front and preceding all other values as if. Now, this structure of, recognition that we want to be recognized by others. This begins, Rousseau here actually introduces a revolutionary paradigm. He says it's a kind of competition was there in, Locke and Hobbes also, because people would compete for scarce resources. Fine. But Rousseau is, sort of discussing this or pointing this at a higher remove. This is that there's a kind of sexual competition as if. I mean, there's no question of scarcity here. But the question is where we want to be. We want to trump others and recognized by somebody, say for instance our beloved one, man or woman, whatever, whoever. Now, as we discussed, remember, try to link this to our first and second lectures on Locke and Hobbes. We were discussing love or friendship as a potent political factor, in fact factors, in political thinking in general, not in the mainstream of course, because we generally think love or friendship or question of passions or emotions, they are marginal to political thinking. But as I try to point out in the case of Hobbes, Locke, and this time in Rousseau, love, passion becomes a potent factor in defining the political formation or the self-constitution of the body politic in when we consider ourselves, right? Now, so what happens is the question of recognition by others. When we try to sort of trump others and get to our beloved, there is a competition, and this competition should be understood in the Rousseauian sense in apparently a negative form, right? Now, what happens is, of course, a kind of, what takes place apart from, this point of self-preservation in terms of self-esteem, self-regard and self-recognition. The one form of self-recognition. I want to be recognized by somebody else, my friend, my lover, or even by my enemy, right? What takes place is a kind of, is violence, So Rousseau is trying to trace a trajectory how historically as if violence takes place, right? This was not in this form available in Locke or Hobbes, right? Now, apart from this, struggle for, self-recognition in the eyes of others, what happens is the introduction of property. So there is, on one side there is relationship, on another side there is the question of property. And Rousseau is very categorical in this, because he says that what constitutes a state of war is not mere personal relationship among people. It is a question of property that constitutes war. And as you know, Marx will pick this up later and will go, at immense length, and will push this thought to an extreme. But significant here is, and we should mark it aside, that in Rousseau, both relationships and property are factors in constituting a state of war. What is the solution, as we were sort of speculating? How does Rousseau approach this problem? As we said, that for Rousseau, social contract is a problem-solving procedure. And Rousseau introduces social contract here. But to begin with, in fact, as you know, it is general in general discussions on Rousseau. This quotation is, the beginner's punchline. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Now, we might think, as Rousseau says, the master of others, but we are slaves of, slaves. The question is, Rousseau says, how has this happened? We think we are masters of others, but then we are slaves for ages, actually. We don't know. How has this happened? Rousseau says, I don't know. But how has this been legitimated? How this has become, naturalized? Rousseau says, I'll answer this question. Now, this is the third point you'll remember. By Rousseau's social contract, what Rousseau is discussing, and this concept was absolutely absent in Hobbes and Locke both, the question of legitimacy. And Rousseau uses this particular phrase, legitimacy. So, what does social contract then achieve? Social contract, for the first time in a major way, introduces the question of legitimacy. Then how does the rule become legitimate? Legitimate means, validated. But validated not only by law. In Rousseau, this validation should come from within the community. It should be socially validated. And this is very different from, Locke or Hobbes here. For Rousseau, when a social contract is happening, people come together, right? Now, people come together, they are sort of an aggregate, they are forming an aggregate, right? But they are forming an association. This aggregation leads to an association. And this association basically is a self-association. Like, for instance, if we form a club, right? Now, forming a club is a kind of association, a voluntary association as if, right? And this association, we rule ourselves by our own laws. We give the club our own rules and own laws. And sort of these rules, because we have given those rules, right? We have sort of parted or sort of gave away some of our rights, some of our freedom, okay? But whom have we given them to? Not to a sovereign who is above. Not to a king or a despot who is above. No. We have given it to the community. Now, what is the community? The community of people is basically us. We have given it to our own selves, right? This is Rousseau's general will. So general will is essence or the methodological core of the social contract. The operative concept, the methodological procedure by which social contract founds itself, maintains itself, it could even destroy itself. But the question of, the self-constitution of people coming together, as if we are forming a club. Just imagine this. It will become easier. Now, to make it clearer and to make it easier, Rousseau holds on to a number of examples, right? This example is basically centered on the question of slavery. He talks about Grotius, who is, basically a medieval political thinker, who talked about a peculiar, thing. And it was an assertion which completely stumped Rousseau. What was the assertion? The assertion was this, that if I can become a slave to somebody, right, then whole people could enslave themselves to a king. Whole people could enslave themselves to anybody. But the whole people, how could the whole, a community of people, how could they become slaves to, somebody or somebody else? Because by becoming slave, if somebody is a slave to me, all his rights or her rights are with me. Now, what does he or she have against me? Nothing. His rights are with me. So can I have my rights against myself? This is absurd. If a whole community of people have given themselves to a king as a slave or a community or a foreign community, whatever, then no rights are left. No freedom is left, right? Then what is left? Nothing. So can a whole community of people reduce themselves to nothingness? It is, to argue in a different sense, it is a kind of self-destruction that they, usher into. Now, can a whole lot of people destroy themselves, in a sense, commit a kind of, collective suicide? No, right? By the concept of general will, a will which belongs to each of us and everybody, we cannot become slaves, right? It is not a question of private person, but it is a question of each and all. Okay, a social contract will not allow, through the maneuver or through the method of general will, it cannot allow slavery. The question after this is basically, Rousseau asks this question again with more emphatically, that why do we need a king or a despot? This is important because in Hobbes, as you found, there was an argument, and I, of course, endorsed that argument, that it was an argument in favor of absolutism, where there is no division of powers. In Locke, there is, of course, a separation of powers happening. But Rousseau is clear in this. This is why Rousseau is called, communitarian, because he is trying to speak social contract and locating everything, all rights, all freedom within the community. He says that the king cannot enslave a people or a despot, even though he, can promise tranquility, peace. I mean, making a distinction between the state of war and the state of peace. This is also a difference with, Hobbes and Locke, because in Hobbes and Locke you'll find a lot of discussion on the state of war, but not much you'll find on peace. But Rousseau speaks on the question of peace in some form or the other. He says, you might find a peace in, trying to sort of, use our image. There could be peace in a dustbin or a burial ground, right? There could be a peace in a sort of a space where all are dead. There could be peace in death also. But is that peace desirable? So a peace which is granted or offered by a king or a despot is not something which we could receive, by our own will. So, the moment we cannot receive tranquility or peace, which is a controversial kind of peace, then Rousseau talks, about the destruction of this peace or tranquility. And here actually Rousseau is invoked as a theorist of the revolution. Now, the question is, if freedom, as we said, freedom or liberty could not be given to, to a king or a despot, and the people cannot become slaves or blind subjects, then, as we said, which or who reigns supreme? It is, of course, the community. As problem-solving procedure, what improvement does the social contract, bring in? That's the question. The question is this, but the answer is something, more important and something more crucial. The question is of morality. If one says that if I become a slave, if the people become slaves, then what happens? I mean, what Rousseau is saying, technically it's not possible. I mean, by the virtue of general will or social contract, this is not possible. That's quite technical. But suppose, even if, a private person secretly tries to become a slave of somebody, what is wrong with it? Rousseau says, it is immoral. By giving up freedom, by trying to give up freedom, what you're giving up is all question of morality. Slavery gives no right. Force gives no right. And these are all very important questions with Rousseau, because, as you know, and it is something to be marked with a red pen perhaps, that what differentiates modern political thinking from medieval or ancient political thinking is basically this notion of freedom. Rousseau is very much a thinker of liberty or freedom. Though, as you know, in Locke we were discussing liberty, right? But in Rousseau, this question flourishes and takes on astounding forms. It is immoral to give up freedom, immoral to give up your own right. So modern political thinking is a kind of thinking which is based on basically freedom, basically on the question of right. Okay? Rousseau, before introducing social contract and general will, talks about this question of freedom and right as a question of morality. One will say this is a question of political morality. It's not a question of sheer good and bad, right? It's a question of right and wrong. Okay? So this is how Rousseau is a modern and revolutionary thinker. Not only the thinker of social contract, as often he is, sort of construed to become, even if it is his destiny. Thank you.